is. Okay, so maybe it picks up some. We're continuing where we were left off last week, which is we've begun the Ten Commandments. We're now on the second of the Ten Commandments. We're in Parshat Yitro. As always, we're following the order of the Sefer HaChinuch, which goes, it's right there, which follows according to the Parshiot. So if you're following along, that means we are up to mitzvah number 26. That is, we should not believe in any divinity but the eternal Lord alone. We'll look at the Hebrew in just a moment. As I mentioned last week, the Sefer Chinuch believes there's a few mitzvot within the Aseret HaDibrot, mitzvah of not having any other gods. In other words, any other gods. In other words, the Rambam says it's one mitzvah, and it's one of the 10 Commandments. The Sefer Chinuch says there's actually 14 commandments within the 10 commandments. That's why our preference is to call it the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 utterances, because within those 10 utterances, there's more than 10 commandments. And the Sefer Chinuch actually gives us 4 different elements, and we'll talk about each one of them to a certain extent. Rather than doing 4 different classes, we'll do one class that sort of looks at all 4 of these ideas. I'll just read it in the English first, and we'll see in the Hebrew as well. Mitzvah number 26 in his counting is not to believe in any other divinity but God. 27 is not to make a graven image. I should point out that the Rambam also holds this as a mitzvah, but he knows that it's repeated later on in the Torah, and so therefore he counts it over there, whereas the Sefer Chinuch finds an additional reason to explain something there. Mitzvah number 28 is not to prostrate oneself. Okay? The Rambam understands not to bow down to idols as part of the mitzvah of not to have any other gods before God. So he calls it all part of one mitzvah, and it's details within it. The Sefer Chinuch says this is a separate mitzvah. Bowing down has its own separate element to it. We can understand that to a certain extent, if you think about it for a moment, bowing down. We have it in Judaism as well, of course. We have it in the Aleinu, we have it in the Shemona Esrei, on Rosh Hashanah, we go all the way down, on Yom Kippur. There's a lot of bowing. And there's actually, I think, 18 different forms of bowing in biblical times, meaning there's the full prostration, there's with the knees, and each one means something slightly different in terms of how you were to express your faith in God. For example, in the Shemona Esrei, the Kohanim, when they would daven, they used to actually bow every single bracha, because they were such at an elevated level, it was important for them to remind themselves the importance of bowing down and sort of demonstrating their humility in front of God. Another meaning of bowing actually comes from the English word. Well, you see it in the Hebrew as well. Bow comes from, anyone want to guess what English word? Yeah. Exactly. To bow. A bow is a bow and arrow. And what you're doing when you bow is you are bending, right? You're bending down like as you pull a bow. But of course, the purpose of the bending with a bow is to eventually spring back to hit a target. And that's what bowing is as well. Bowing is you're not just showing humility. That's one form of bowing, right? That's hishtachaveh. But there's other forms of bowing that are actually about to jump up so that you can better serve God faster. Yes? Right, knees. Exactly. So there's different forms. So anyway, the Sefer Chinuch says that's a separate mitzvah. We're doing some house cleaning first before we get to the meat of the meaning. Mitzvah number 29, not to worship an idol in the way that it is customarily worshipped. We'll see the Sefer Chinuch says there's 4 different types of customary forms of worship. They're bowing. Anyone want to guess some of the other ones? How would you, not that you should know, but how would you normally think that people might worship an idol? Some would throw rocks, so that's actually a machloket, because the customary way of serving is to pour on an idol something, and some say throwing rocks is part of that same idea of sort of pouring on it something else. Others say, no, it's a separate form of worship. There is sacrifice, right? That's a traditional way as well. And we'll see some other customary, and we'll also see the Sefer Chinuch points out even non-customary forms of worship are also prohibited. And we'll see what that means in a moment. And then that's mitzvah 29, and then 30 already is not to swear in vain, which already moves us to another commandment. So we're going to look at general, the prohibition of not to have any other God except for God. And we're going to try to understand what that means, not just what that means biblically, but what that means today. And the reason, yeah.
It's worrying that this adds, the Ten Commandments are exactly the same, and that adds to the 10 or 14.
Right.
That's the one that's a fourth count separately.
Right. Well, so we're going to see that when we get to Shabbat, how the Sefer Chinuch counts it. Sometimes he counts it the same. You'll see it more clearly with something like lo tachmod, do not covet. Do not covet appears here, and do not desire appears here, and do not covet appears in Devarim. And so those are different, says the Sefer Chinuch. They're part of the same idea, but they're on a spectrum. Do not desire is do not sort of allow yourself to begin contemplating wanting something, and then coveting is actually making plans towards that endeavor. He counts them as two. There's other mitzvot, by the way. There's actually a number of mitzvot that have to do with idol worship throughout the Torah. Not just these four I mentioned by the Sefer Chinuch. He has, many others that repeat themselves. Part of that is he follows the teachings of the Rambam. We may have mentioned this once before. The Rambam, in his Moreh Nevuchim, I mentioned this idea of kavanah rishonah and kavanah shniyah, which is the kavanah rishonah is God's initial intention of how the world was to work, how the Torah was to work. And basically, it's mitzvot that speak directly to human nature that doesn't change. Kavanah Shniyah, the second intention, is what happens if a different historical contingency took place. In other words, we didn't necessarily need to live in a world with idol worship. What happens if there's never idol worship in the world? So then, the Rambam says, a great number of the mitzvot we have are coming to counter the influence of idol worship. So it's a second intention mitzvah by God's point of view. If there's never any idol worship, we wouldn't have specific mitzvot that need to counter that impact. So in the Rambam's understanding, a great number of the mitzvot in the Torah are actually only as a result of the historical realities at that time. So not everyone will count all of the idol worship mitzvot as mitzvot because view them sort of only as contemporary to the actual period of time. Which raises the question is, what does it mean here? Because this is not, if it's part of the Ten Commandments, it's not because of a historical reality. There's something very fundamental here. And the question is, what is the mitzvah today? If there is, if we look around, isn't the same. So people have offered different suggestions. One of them I saw was raised after, if you remember, I think we just commemorated not too long ago, the anniversary of the terror attack in Mumbai. In the terror attack in Mumbai, where the Chabad rabbi Holtzberg, Gavriel Holtzberg and Rivka Holtzberg were murdered. And Netanyahu was just in India, right? And I think he brought along their son, who said one day he wants to be the shaliach there. And when he passed away, when he was killed, there was a lot of written up about Gavriel Holtzberg. And someone wrote, I don't know if it's true or not, but he wrote that Gavriel Holtzberg was always very careful not to say the word Mumbai when he referred to the city, but rather Mumbai. So people asked, maybe that's just the Ashkenazic pronunciation of, Mumbai. He says, no. Mumbai, right? Mumbai is the name of the city in India that used to be called Bombay. Bombay is the British term that was a corruption of Mumbai. But Mumbai, which in 1995 it returned to that name, is actually named after an Indian god. And so Gavriel Holtzberg apparently was very careful, says this writer, not to say the name of Mumbai correctly because it sounded like he was saying the name of a god. And there is a prohibition. Some people say it's in this particular mitzvah that we're learning today. Some say it's actually a little bit later in Mishpatim, in Shmot 23:13, if you want to look it up. It says, do not lahaskir, do not cause or do not remember the name of any type of idol. And so some people say that means you can't say a god of a different religion. Because if you were to do that, that's violating this prohibition. And by the way, it's not as easy as you might think. Right, so first of all, you can't say, Tuesday, or, you can't also say the first 6 months, right, January, February, March, these are all names of gods. But some say, in fact, that is the prohibition. You're not allowed to actually say those things. The Gemara gives us a slightly different example. The Gemara says you're not supposed to mention the names of gods if it's to their benefit. In other words, if you tell someone, meet me at such and such a street, across from, and then you mention the name of some type of idol worship place, so that's, and you could have said across from the McDonald's, right? I don't know if that's any better, but in any event, but if you could have used some other option and you gave, in a sense, praise to that, that's what the real prohibition is. Or if you cause people to praise. For example, the Rambam writes in teaching us about the concept of darcy shalom. Darcy shalom is, or mipnei eva. Mipnei eva means there are certain prohibitions that are suspended if they're rabbinic prohibitions, because we don't want to cause animosity with other people. So for example, why do we have a Kohen first? Because if you fought every time who's going to get the first aliyah, there would be argumentation. So they say, darchei shalom, for the purposes of peace, you should always have a Kohen, Levi, Yisrael. That'll make life a little bit easier. And then there are other things. For example, if a non-Jew is collecting a peah or shichacha, on the fields, you do not prevent him, even though mina Torah anyway, but the Rabbanan, you do not allow him to take it, but mipnei darchei shalom, for the purposes of peace, or mipnei eva, because if you prevented him, there might be pogroms, so you then therefore don't prevent him. So the Rambam says, based upon this mitzvah, based upon the Talmudic understanding, you're not supposed to do business with a non-Jew a few days before his holiday. Why? Because he has a good business. He'll praise his God. And that's lahaskir. You've now just caused him to praise his God. The Rambam says, continuing the thought of darchei shalom, and mipnei eva, of enmity, he says, and what happens if he wants to give you a present? So you're not allowed to accept the present before the holiday, because he will also feel good, and maybe he's giving you the present as a part of celebrating his holiday, so you should not accept it. And so someone asked the question, says, what happens if that causes enmity, if I refuse to accept his gift? So the Rambam says, that's fine. You can take it, but then throw it down. So, exactly. So one of the commentaries on the Rambam says, that's even worse. If he sees you throw it down. So the ultimate conclusion in the Shulchan Aruch, the Mishnah Berurah, is you take it, you let him go, you do not benefit from that gift at all, do not use it, and if you're able to get rid of it later, you then get rid of it later, mipnei eva, or mipnei darchei shalom, so that there's a sense of peace. There's other examples where you might be mentioning avodah zarah in one way or the other. I have a friend, I don't know if I've mentioned this before, they built a synagogue in Toco Hills, Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States. And they built it in a subdevelopment that was developed by the same individual who was a religious Christian, and he named all of the streets with religious names. And I kid you not, their synagogue is located at the corner of two streets. One street's name is Mary, and the other street's name is Christmas. I kid you not, that's the address of the synagogue. Now, every time you want to give the address of that synagogue, you might say, meet me at the corner of Mary, Christmas, which could be a problem based upon here. Of course, it's important to note that the Meiri tells us that Christianity is not avodah zarah. Throughout the Middle Ages, the rabbis go back and forth talking about Christianity and Islam, whether or not they're more problematic or less problematic from a Jewish theological point of view. And each side has a benefit. Christianity, for example, accepts the Torah as a testament, right? They call it the Old Testament, but they still accept it. Islam, the Quran, doesn't view the Torah as holy. On the other hand, the Islam has sort of a greater purity in terms of monotheism as opposed to Christianity and the Trinity. So some would always say that Christianity is more akin to Judaism, while others say Islam is more akin to Judaism. So it depends who you speak to. But in any event, that could be a problem, and you also see it elsewhere as well. Do you know any Jewish people from, let's say, Europe that would pronounce the name of their town incorrectly? A town in Europe that may pronounce it incorrectly. It could be anywhere. Exactly, that's a problem. The Satmar have a big problem. Satmar is Saint Mary. And so they say the Satmar Rebbe actually never called it Satmar. He called it Sak with a K, Mer, because he didn't want to possibly be violating this prohibition. But you have the problem across the world. St. Louis, right? All these different things, you could have the problem. And so it raises the question, is this what the mitzvah is really about? On one hand, you could argue that it is. You could say, we are so concerned with Avodah Zarah that every single time we speak, we have to be thinking about whether or not we are giving credit or not. I, however, think that it's getting a little bit overdone, thank you, right? It seems like there might be a value to this at some point in time, but this is what the Ten Commandments is all about. You would think you want something more foundational, more fundamental than simply being careful with possibly giving some credit to someone else's God. So that's what I want to look at today, is what might be the relevance for us today in a sort of more global, more significant way. Towards that end, let's look at the Sefer HaChinuch to begin with, and then we will go and look at a few different points. The Sefer HaChinuch is on, in Hebrew, I apologize, I'll translate. It's on the right-hand column of the first page. Sefer HaChinuch is at the top. Mitzvah number 26, Shelo na'amin be'Elohei b'lilti Hashem levado. You should not believe in any other gods. Shelo na'amin Elohim zulati Hashem yitbarach levado. You should not believe in any other gods. Shenemar, as it is written in Shmot Kaf Gimmel. Kaf, chapter 20, verse 3. Lo yeh lecha Elohim acharim al panai. You should not have any other gods before me. Perusho, and its explanation, its meaning is, ha-mitzvah hi ha'ikar hagadol shebatorah. This is the most important mitzvah in the Torah. She'hakol talui alav. Everything depends upon it. So it doesn't seem like it's a word-related type of thing, something much more fundamental. Kmo shamamru Chazal, as the rabbis taught in the Sifri, kol hamodeh be'avodah zara ki'ilu kafar b'chol haTorah kulo. Anyone who admits to idol worship is as if they have admitted or is as if they have denied the entire Torah. Torah and idol worship are antithetical to one another. They can't exist. They can't reside with one another at all. There is no middle ground in this regard. And if you receive anyone who accepts other gods, even if you say, I accept also God, and if you follow the way they do their service, the traditional way of doing their service, we mentioned about those, of the Arba Avodot Yeduot, the four well-known forms of idol worship, which is sacrifice, incense, right, near the end of that first paragraph, Zibuach, V'kitor, Nisuach. Nisuach is, pouring water or wine, or might be also the stones, the Hishtachvaya, and also the bowing down. Those are all problematics. All avar al lo yeh lecha. If you've done any of those four things, you have violated bowing, right? You have violated the prohibition in that regard. Okay. What I want to sort of begin questioning is the language that not only the Sefer Chinuch uses, but the Torah itself says. The Torah says, Lo yeh lecha Elohim acharim. You should not have any other gods. So what's the problem with that statement? Great, thank you. No worries. It's my Valentine's Day card. See, it's pink and everything. There you go. We're just talking about whether or not you're allowed to say such things as Valentine's and things along those lines. Right, that's exactly. We didn't call it saint. The question also becomes if the whole reason why something is elevated is not because of religious reasons, but because of the greeting card company wants to make a lot of money. That might be another issue. Okay. So what's the problem with the Torah's language? You should not have any other gods before me. What does it assume? As if there are other gods. How could the Torah say such a thing? It's assuming a falsity already. What does it mean, other gods? How could you say that? So the Mechilta, which is at the very below all of the Sefer Chinuch, the first word is Elohim Acharim, asks this very question. It says, what? V'chia Elohuten? Are they really other gods? It doesn't make any sense to say that there's other gods. And then gives a sort of, there's the semantic answer. We had to use that word because that's what other people use. They call it God, so that's why we're doing it. Rav Hirsch, we mentioned this once before, tells us gods don't necessarily mean things that you worship in terms of gods, but rather they could be values or qualities or geniuses of a society. If you remember when we talked about the battle between the angel of Esav and Yaakov, it says that the Sar, the angel of Esav, is that what was really taking place is a battle of values, what Yaakov represented and what Esav represented. Or when Rav Hirsch says the same language with regards to God says, and I will destroy the gods of Egypt. That also seems problematic. What does it mean, God will destroy the gods of Egypt? There aren't gods in Egypt. So they're all false. So Rav Hirsch explains there, no, says, what did Egypt represent? When we talk about gods in the Bible, it's talking about what is the genius of that society, or what is the most important value in that society. So that's the other possibilities, that you should not have any other highest values, isms. And we're going to come to that exact idea, isms. If you look at the top left-hand corner, Rav Moshe Sternbach, we're going to look at that in just a little bit, he says isms. Okay, that's what he's saying is the real issue of Avodah Zarah, and we're gonna get to that in just a moment. But before we get to him, I want to offer some other possible explanations of why it uses Elohim Acharim, other gods. So if you look at the very bottom source, this is the Rabbeinu Bachai, and there are three ideas he offers to answer this question. Right? There's a Gimmel at the very front. Lo yeh lecha Elohim acharim, right? You should not have any other gods before me. Go to the third line, okay? I mean, the first two lines he basically says, don't have any other gods, any other forces, any other stars, mazalot, and don't believe in anything like those at all. And then if you see on the third line, right after there's an 11, the footnote, it says, umasha karam acharim. What does it mean, others? Why does it mean other gods? How could there be other gods? How could there be, what does other mean? Amru b'sifrei, it says in the sifrei, al kihem acharim la'ovdehem. They are other to their servants. They're others to their servants. They are different. They are estranged to those who worship them. Meaning, part of the problem of Avodah Zarah is that other people, it's almost that there's a sympathy for the worshiper of Avodah Zarah, because the worshiper of Avodah Zarah has a misunderstanding of what a relationship to God is meant to be all about. They are acharim. They are different. They are separate from them altogether. I'll tell you a wonderful story that I told in shul a couple weeks ago. I don't know, Ruthie, if you were there, about Onkelos. Onkelos, we're familiar, right? He's the translator. So the story of Onkelos is a convert to Judaism. He grew up in a very wealthy household in Rome. In fact, his uncle, his mother's brother, was the Emperor Hadrian. So he grew up in the royal household, and he was spoiled, and he got to basically sit in the library all day, and he learned philosophy and religion and theory, and he learned mathematics and astronomy. He learned everything. He was one of the smartest individuals in Roman society. And at some point in time, he comes to his uncle, and he says to his uncle Hadrian, he says, listen, I want to go out into the world now. What good is all this knowledge? I want to make a living. I want to go into business. He wants to basically leave the kollel and begin to get a job. He says, and I've come to you because you probably have good advice. You've accomplished a lot. what piece of advice do you have for me who wants to go out and begin a career? So the uncle, Hadrian, was very touched by this, and he says, I'll tell you one piece of advice. Same piece of advice people have been giving, people want to go into business for a long time. Buy low and sell high, right? Find something that doesn't cost that much or is undervalued, and then convince people that it has a tremendous amount of value, and then sell it for the higher price. So he says, okay, good idea. He begins to travel. He travels to all these different places in the world, in the Roman Empire, and he comes to Judea, which is one of the vassal states of Rome. And there he meets with a few of the students of Rabbi Yochanan, and he becomes impressed with Judaism. And he ultimately learns in yeshiva, and he converts to Judaism. So the Emperor Hadrian says, where's my nephew? He hears some strange things that he's gotten stuck in Judea. So he sends some soldiers to take him back. The Gemara in Avodah Zarah tells us that he shares with him, meaning Uncle shares some teachings with these soldiers who come. It doesn't tell us what the teachings are. Everyone wants to know what they were. But whatever he teaches them, it impresses them so much, they convert to Judaism. So the Emperor Hadrian begins to get a little bit upset. He gets another group of soldiers, and he says, I want you to go bring back my nephew right now. I'm very upset with him. But don't let him talk to you, because who knows what's going to happen. Go. So they go, they begin to round him up, and he says, I know you're not supposed to talk to me. I don't want you to disobey an order, but do you mind if I ask you a question? They say, well, what harm could there be in a question? So he asks them the question, he says, okay, I know that the captain has to have a torch that he runs in front of the duke. And the duke carries a torch, and he has to run it in front as a sign of honor and protection in front of the governor. And the governor has to take a torch and run it in front of the emperor. But who takes a torch and runs in front of the emperor? And they said, well, that's a silly question. No one does. The emperor doesn't have to run in front of anyone. He's his own man. That's it. That's the end of the road. So they say, why do you ask? And he says, well, I was just reading the Parsha, and the Parsha tells when the Jews were leaving Egypt, God went in front of all the Jews, right, with a pillar of fire. And that apparently made a big impression upon them. And they all converted to Judaism as well. So the emperor hears this story, says, listen, don't talk to him, don't let him ask you any questions, just get him and bring him back here. They go, they grab him, they bring him out the door, and as he's going out the door, he kisses the mezuzah, and he starts to get a big smile on his face and be very happy and dance, and the soldiers say, wait a second, we're about to take you to your death. Why would you be so happy? What does that mean what did you just kiss? What's going on here? And he says, well, in Roman theory, where do you put, where is the emperor if there's a war or something like that? You put the emperor inside the palace, and all the guards surround him. He says, in Judaism, we are on the inside, and God is on the outside. The mezuzah is a sign that God's all around our house protecting us. And that impresses them as well. And they convert to Judaism as well. And at this point in time, the Emperor Hadrian says, okay, you know what? I'm not sending anyone else. He sends a notice. He says, I'm not going to kill you anymore. You can go your own way, but I want to know what's going on with you. What happened? So he comes to visit. I promise I won't kill you. They have a meeting, and he tells his uncle, he says, all I did exactly what you told me to do. You said, buy low and sell high. I found the Jewish people, and I found the Torah, which is not respected throughout the whole world, is not known throughout the whole world. It's very lowly, but it has a tremendous amount of value. And now I'm trying to sell it high. So one of the things that's nice about that story, I think, is what convinces the Romans at the end of the day. To a certain extent, it's the anti-hierarchy of Jewish life. Right? The Romans is all very hierarchical. You know that if you're the governor, you're below the emperor, and if you're the governor, you're above the duke, and that's it. And the soldier, and the citizen, and the non-citizen, it's all very, very much structured. In Judaism, God is above us all, and therefore we are all on some level equal because of that, but it's more than that, I think, that God is protecting us, right? It's not us of course we're serving God, right? We are servants to God, but there's a relationship, and God cares for us, which is very antithetical to ancient religious beliefs. The gods were very, whimsical. They would do whatever they wanted to do, and they're very capricious. They would, the flood story was basically that they were woken up because human beings made too much noise in the Gilgamesh. And if you look at all the different stories that are, the gods, the Roman gods and the Greek gods, they're all fighting amongst themselves, and basically it's all about them and whether or not their honors are protected or not. God cares for the Jewish people. That's a fundamental message of belief in God, that God cares for us. You see this, by the way, if we go back to, I mentioned the ancient stories. Very often the ancient parallel stories to the Bible were well known. And you have to read the Bible understanding that. When you read the story of the flood, for example, Gilgamesh, everyone would have known that story of Gilgamesh. And so when the Torah tells the story, there's a very powerful impact when you get to the end of our story. Because what's at the end of the Torah story is the dove. And everyone in those days knew that the dove was a symbol of peace and hope, and the olive branch. The Gilgamesh story ends with the black raven. And everyone understands that the raven was a sign of dread, that the world is getting worse. And so when the Torah comes along, it was revolutionary in its literature, in its literary makeup, because it tells the story of the dove. And all of a sudden, everyone would have known, well, there's another story out there. But what I'm now reading, meaning I'm now talking thousands of years after it happened with Noah, is something different. God cares for us. It's a dove. And that's one of the fundamental messages of the Torah, is that God cares for us, has a relationship with us. God is carrying the torch in front of us, so to speak. So what the Rabbeinu Chaya says when he says that their gods are acharim to them, they're distant, they're estranged to them, it's saying that's the whole reason why you can't have Elohim acharim. Make sure that you understand that God has a closeness and a concern and a care for you. So that's the first point that the Rabbeinu Bachaya makes. I want to just jump for a moment to the third point he makes. Actually, we could do this one too. It doesn't make a difference. We'll go to the second one. Dvar acher, right? It's now the fourth line in that section. The fourth line says Dvar acher. Acharim means hayom shel zahav, lemachar shel kesef, lemachar shel eitz. That's the second one. So what does that mean? It says basically, today they're worshiping something that's gold, tomorrow it's silver, then it's wood. It's almost as if their belief in God is a fad, right? It could change at any point in time. And indeed, that's one of the problems of Avodah Zarah, is that there is no constancy. When we say Hashem Echad, we're not saying that God is one. We're saying God is constant. God doesn't change, right? There is a permanence to the nature of God. And another thing that we're saying is, when God doesn't change, that means we can't change God. One of the problems in ancient societies is, the pasuk says, don't make for yourself any foreign gods. One of the way the Hasidim read it is, don't make yourself into a foreign god. Because one of the problems of human beings is we project onto others what we ourselves are often thinking or feeling. And in the ancient world, they did that with their gods. So if the Romans wanted to go to war, they could find, and this is one of the problems of polytheism, they could find a god who's the god of war. And if they wanted to make peace, they could find a god who's the god of peace. And basically you then had conflicts between gods, right? There's moral relativism. It's whatever you personally believe, and then you could find a god to support that particular belief. Exactly. So now it's the God is serving human beings rather than... so God says, the acherim is gold, silver, it's whatever you want. It's going to be this tomorrow, the next day. God is one. That means there's one morality. It's not me influencing God, but actually God, right? This is the other half of the relationship. God cares for me, but also I have certain obligations to follow God, that God is above me, not that God is below me, that I somehow can dictate what God does. Okay. The third teaching that he has is, let me get this, is the next line. I'm sorry, I skipped over. Did I? Oh, yes, okay. It's at the end of the fourth line. Va'ayikar, the real essence, ki nikru'u acharim, why they are called others, al shem shemakablin koach me'acher, that they receive their powers from another. Ve'ein lehem koach me'atzmam, and they don't have their own power. One of the concerns in Judaism with idol worship is a belief in intermediaries. A belief that you can't, intermediaries. That's the problem. If you look at the back side of the source sheet, what I have here is the Rambam's introduction to the Hilchot Avodot Chokavim in the Mishnah Torah. And if you've never read it, it's really worthwhile to read the Rambam's understanding. It's different than we often understand how Avodah Zarah came into the world. What he explains is as follows. I'll say it outside for the purposes of time. He says, in the beginning, everyone believed in God, right? God creates Adam, Chava. How could you not believe in God? And then in the time of Enosh, right, the grandchildren, there's already a mistake that happened. What was the mistake? It was an honest mistake. They said, well, we of course believe in God. No one says I don't believe in God. But since God created the world and God created the sun and the moon, doesn't it make sense to honor the sun and the moon, not because we believe the sun and moon have their own powers, but because they're creations of God? So they start they start honoring the sun and the moon. And then the next generation says, oh, our parents are honoring the sun and the moon, but they're so far away, why don't we begin to build temples for the sun and the moon? And the next generation has priests that are telling people that you have to worship here in this temple in order to get to the sun and the moon because the sun and moon are too far, and all of a sudden they forget about God altogether. In other words, what seems to take place, and the Rambam says it's almost part of human nature, is that people begin to have a need for something more concrete and as an intermediary between us and God. That sort of the ineffable and the intangible is a little bit too hard for us to fully grasp what that thing is, what that God is. The Degel Reuven has a beautiful teaching. Degel Reuven was chief rabbi of Petach Tikva, and he points out at the end of the Torah, right, the God, and as well as at the story of the Ten Commandments, Moshe smashes the tablets, and it says that it was good in the eyes of God, and the Rashi says, Yasher Koach, right, congratulations that you smashed the tablets. Why is it Yasher Koach that you smashed the tablets? So the Degel Reuven says, because if Moshe never smashed the tablets, right, he could have saved them. Think about it, it's logical. The people are sinning, so you punish God by smashing holy tablets? It seems, incongruous. But God says, no, it was a good thing you smashed them, because what would they have done? They would have begun to worship the tablets themselves. So by smashing the tablets, you remove the possibility that people would make the mistake of believing that the tablets could be an intermediary between them and God. And so Judaism comes along and says, there's no such thing as intermediaries between me and God. Every human being, right, can go straight to God. You talk straight to God. You don't talk to a priest in order to get to God. You don't go through any other intermediary. So it raises an interesting question with regards to Hasidim, because what the Hasidim would say, of course, is no, they're speaking to God, but the Hasid helps them formulate their language and helps them sort of push their prayers higher up to God. But you're absolutely right that it does sometimes get borderline, and it could be a danger in that regard. Certainly, according to the Rambam would have very little patience for people going to Umam on every Rosh Hashanah and going to graves and things along those lines. He would have a little bit of a problem with that. So that's another concern that the Rabbeinu B'chai says is the problem of Elohim Acharim, that there is this need for intermediaries, and you have to be careful in that regard. Okay. What I'd like to now do is go back to the Sefer Chinuch for just a moment, and where he talks about, that's on the front page, where he talks about is the traditional ways of serving God. This is sort of I'm saying in parentheses because it's an interesting point, I think. And then he also says, by the way, also don't do things that are not the customary ways. So for example, he gives the example of urinating on an idol. He says, you may think that's a good thing, but you know what? There is actually some, he quotes the Sabaeans in his Moreh Nevuchim, and all of their practices, and sometimes urinating is actually a form of worshiping gods. So he says it's not about you and your kavanah. A large part of it is your own personal intention, but some of it is also is how your actions are perceived by others. You have to be also careful that there's an ethical element. There's an interpersonal element in Avodah Zarah as well. It's not just in what's in your heart, but also how you behave and how it will be interpreted by others, which goes back to some of the other points we were speaking about, that if you speak about polytheism, that means there's a multiplicity of ethical options. I could go to war here now, or I don't have to go to war. So therefore, everything becomes appropriate in terms of ethical behavior, and part of the idea of saying don't have any other gods means there's only one ethical behavior given each particular instance. So he's, by the way, as an aside, when he first wrote that, it reminded me of something I read in a book called Nudge, which is a book about trying to encourage certain types of behavior without people realizing that they're being encouraged to this behavior. So to give the example of trying to get men in public bathrooms, particularly at airports, not to make a mess when they go to the stalls to urinate. And it's a big problem, apparently, because it depends. You have to pay overtime. People come in more cleaning, everything like that. So they've tried everything. They put signs. They, try to embarrass. All these different things. What has become the most successful device in the last 10 years, 20 years, is they put a little fly. Women, you wouldn't know this necessarily, but have you seen a little fly in the urinals? And apparently men, when they see the little fly, they aim for that fly, and it solves a lot of problems in terms of cleanliness and the like. Okay, so that's the reason I mentioned that, not so much that, but the idea that the Sefer Chinuch mentions there's non-extraordinary or customary ways of serving is because it actually provides an insight, I think, into a complicated scene in the Torah. When Rachel and Yaakov run away from Lavan, she takes what? Right? She takes the teraphins, the little gods, right? What are we supposed to make of that story, that Rachel is taking these little idols from her father? So are we to believe that she's connected to idol worship? By the way, some say yes. Some say akin to what the Rambam was teaching, that it starts off with a mistake. You could have good intentions. And that's where Rachel was. She grew up in that. She was weaned off it, but you know what? It's always just around the corner. And you always have to be on your guard against idol worship. That could be the case. She could have done that. There are a few other interpretations. By the way, you speak about modern day problems like Hasidim and the question of an intermediary. What could also be the parallel? Some people felt these teraphins were like good luck charms. What does that sound potentially like in modern day Jewish thought? Good luck charms. Good luck charms. Yeah. Because there's an element, it looks like it's a Avodah Zarah to be relying on a good luck charm, if that's what it was. Maybe it's less Avodah Zarah, but it still seems problematic. What else do we have, right? You have the chamsa, or the amulets, right? The red string, okay? So I'm not a big fan of the red string, and I don't know where it developed. I mean, it comes from the idea that if you wear a string that was wrapped around Rachel Imenu, the kever Rachel, 7 times, that you will carry your children to term. That's if you look in the sort of the mystical understandings, that's where it seems to have developed. Many people, it's by the way not a modern thing. It existed for quite some time. And in each generation there are people who have either rallied against it or tried to defend it. The Tosafot actually speak about it, and they are against it. They say this is a darchei amoraim, that this is a custom of a foreign custom and you shouldn't do it. Rav Hirsch, however, found an actual, I thought, a very beautiful insight to justify it. He says, listen, he's not for it either, but he says the red string is supposed to ward against the ayin hara, the evil eye. Right, exactly. So he says, what's the ayin hara? He says, forget about the mystical. The practical, what often happens is a person is successful, a person becomes very wealthy, becomes very powerful, and they begin to think it's all thanks to them. And then they begin to act arrogantly, And then there are reactions because of how they react, both in terms of distancing them in their relationship with God as well as with other people. So he says, what's the red string? He says the color of red was used in the Beit HaMikdash. He says, where was the red come from? The red comes from the worms, the shamir that was used to cut the stones. Their blood, or their course, was red. And he says, so when you look at the red, you remember the worm, the very small, simple, the lowliest of the lowly. And so no matter how great you become, you look at that red string and you remind yourself that I need to be humble, and therefore you ward off the ayin hara, not in a mystical sense, but in a very practical sense. You're always reminding yourself, however you're doing, you should always be careful in that regard. Okay, so maybe that was something connected with what Rachel was doing as well. There's another possibility. We found an ancient tablet that speaks about a certain law in the, I'll tell you the tablet's name in just a moment, the Nuzi tablets. And they speaks of a law of inheritance that says very often a son-in-law was adopted by his father-in-law, and would work for him. And however, when the father-in-law died, all of the property and the wealth would go to the biological son, unless the father gave a sign that he wanted his adopted son-in-law to take the wealth, in which case, what was the sign? That he would give him all of his teraphins. So Rachel might have been arguing that Yaakov, my husband, has worked for my father and has created all his wealth, and now that we're leaving, when my father dies, all of the wealth, perhaps my brothers will make the claim that it's theirs because they're the biological sons and not Yaakov's. So I'm taking these as a sign that, in fact, the wealth is actually can stay with us. One last idea, and this is the reason why I mentioned this whole idea, is that what does Rachel do with these small little idols? She sits on them, and she says she sits on them. I'm in my menstrual cycle, so I can't get up. So usually we think of that as just a ruse. But some commentators say, no, it was true. She actually was in her menstrual cycle. And some say that she was actually trying to disgrace the idols, meaning she wasn't worshiping the idol worshippers, but this was her way, like urinating on an idol, this was what she was actually trying to do. And it was actually a statement of how she is not, a statement of disrespect to the idols, that she was actually making that type of claim, and that's what was taking place in this whole scene. Anyway, it's an interesting possible interpretation, and it would only work, right, because she's not, remember, the Torah doesn't condemn her for it, right? It doesn't say that Rachel was impure or anything. So it can only work if that was not a form of worship, and presumably it was not. But you have to be careful. You have to know when the non-customary is a form and when it is not a form. Okay, I want to end, with an interesting halachic debate that was raised by based upon the Sefer Chinuch and the Minchas Chinuch's interpretation of the Sefer Chinuch. So you remember the Sefer Chinuch says one of the forms of worshiping Avodah Zarah, the traditional forms, is sacrifice. So the Minchas Chinuch, which is right on the left-hand side, I'm sorry that it's very small. In the book, it's also very small. So he raises an interesting question. He says, does the sacrifice that you bring have to be shechted? Does it have to be slaughtered in a kosher way? I mean, does the sacrifice have to be a kosher animal that you could potentially even eat? Now, what would you think? Yes. Why yes? Remember, for idol worship. By the way, I would say no. I would say, someone's bringing idol worship. What do they care whether or not it's kosher or not kosher, shechted at all?
Doesn't seem to fit at all.
Yeah, not at all. But you're right. The answer is yes. The Minchas Chinuch says it actually has to have two signs. If you see the part where I underlined, Vadai tzarich liyot sheyishchat kedin shchita, Dahainu rov bet simanim bebehema, or rov aleph siman be'of, absolutely needs to be shechted properly and kosher, two simanim in the large animals and one in the chicken. The im lo hachi, and if this were not the case, lo michrei zvicha, this is not called a sacrifice. So that means the Ovdei Avodah Zarah has to know about the kosher laws of shechita, which is an absolutely crazy idea if you think about it. And he goes even further. He gives another example, a ben bakua. A ben bakua, which is in the middle of this whole piece. A ben bakua is an animal. This is a crazy case as well. Let's say you have a cow, and you do shechita on the cow, and then you have the animal, the cow was pregnant, and there's now an animal that comes out and that's alive. That's a ben bakua. According to the halacha, that baby, when it grows up, doesn't need shechita in order to be kosher, because its mother was already shechted, so it's a rare case that happens, and you don't need to do shechita or anything like that. So he says, in that instance, does that animal have to be kosher shechita in order to provide and serve? And also, the answer is yes. And so many of the commentaries question the Minchas Chinuch, but he bases it on the Rambam. Why in the world would we care if an Ovdei Avodah Zarah, when they're about to worship their gods, does a kosher shechita? Why is kosher? How does it even come into the picture? What kind of Ovdei Avodah Zarah are we actually talking about? Which comes back to the Moshe Sternbach, or Moshe Sternbach source at the top of the page. And what he says is what you say. He says, you can only have one God. It's about God. Everything else has to be secondary. If there's ever something that's elevated to the same level of God, any other ism, he says it in the third line, Bismanenu shemosrim nafsham al eze idealim shonim, that we've handed over our souls to a certain type of ideology. If there's any other ism, it's communism, it's, by the way, feminism. Rav Kook speaks positively about feminism. He says it's part of the evolutionary process that there should be greater rights for women. That's the revealing nature of Torah. He says that's positive. But feminism can't become the same as God. Just as anything. Capitalism brings people out of poverty. Great. Socialism cares for people. But nothing can ever get to the same level of God. Nationalism is good, but nothing can ever, God always has to be our most number one concern. Now, the thing that I think is interesting and important about this point is he's talking about positive things. Meaning no one usually, I shouldn't say no one, but usually people don't say, I love to put my head in a vice, and that's the most wonderful thing in the world, and I become a worshiper of that painful practice. No. What do people become a worshiper of, by and large, is something good, right? And that's, I think, the innovation of Rav Moshe Sternbach and others, that we always think of Avodah Zarah as sacrificing your child to Molech or something, and was part, at one point in time, what Avodah Zarah was, and that has to obviously be, for ethical and spiritual reasons, has to be destroyed. But in every generation, there's a slightly different nature, perhaps, of Avodah Zarah. And what he's saying, in our generation, Avodah Zarah could be something that's good, right? Money, I'm sure I mentioned this before. My wife's grandfather always used to say, rich or poor, money always helps, right? So money is a positive thing. But if you begin to worship it, it becomes a damaging thing. Education is an important thing. But if you cheat, right, in order to get into a good college, and so that's not a good thing, meaning because you placed education, right, your need to get education, above ethical values, which we equate with our relationship with God. So he's basically saying God always has to be number one, and no matter how good anything else is, it can't ever be elevated above that. And I think this might provide us an answer to the question or the challenge the Minchas Chinuch raises for us. Why would we care if the Ovdei Avodah Zarah is doing a kosher shechita or not? Well, who might this person be? And what I'd like to suggest is this person who's doing Ovdei Avodah Zarah, it could have been Molech, but in different generations, it's very dangerous even for the observant Jew. The observant Jew, the one who knows the laws of shechita, who knows this halach, who knows everything, he too has to be careful about engaging in Avodah Zarah. And if we take what is the ultimate good, I would say halacha. You also have to be, I'll say some radical statement, you also have to be careful in your observance of halacha, because even that could potentially become Avodah Zarah if God is not placed above the practice of halacha. What do I mean? There's a famous midrash, perhaps you're familiar with. Why did the Meraglim not want to come to Eretz Yisrael? So they said, to Moshe, if we leave the desert, why did the spies not want to come? If we leave the desert, what happens in the desert? All our clothes are taken care of for us. We get our food from the manna, the water from the rock. We don't have to work. It means we could dedicate our entire lives to studying Torah. Once we enter Eretz Yisrael, we're going to have to become farmers. We're going to have to run a state. We're going to have to provide for the economy. We're going to have to do all these different things. That's going to take away time from learning Torah. So they say to Moshe, we don't want to go into Eretz Yisrael because it means we won't be able to fulfill learning Torah and halacha. And of course, it's the exact opposite, because what did God say? God says, go into Eretz Yisrael. So you can't use halacha as an excuse not to follow God's will. And you see the same thing today. I remember a number of years ago, I was at a big Shabbaton. And in this Shabbaton, it was actually sponsored by an organization from overseas. And their last speaker, he spoke about all of you who have made Aliyah. You have to be very careful, because the communities in the United States are very tight, and we know where all our children are at all times, everything like that. And you've made a risky decision in coming to Israel because your children now will be exposed to all different types of Jews. And so you have to be very... And the whole audience in one got up and raged against the speaker. And there was justification. He was looking at something positive and important, but missing the big picture. And this happens all the time. When people are protesting because they want to be able to stay in yeshiva, for example, and they're protesting by causing damage and danger to other people's lives. So again, you're missing the big picture. You take something good. We're not expecting someone to take something bad, meaning it's perhaps possible that in the secular world they view people learning Torah all day as a bad thing. In the religious world, we don't. We view that as a wonderful thing. But it has to all be done for the service of God. And once it becomes for the service of anything else, that also could become dangerously close to avodah zarah. And so I would suggest, even for those of us in the observant world, we have to be careful about avodah zarah in that form as well. Have a good week.